In my experience on talking about stories, villains are something I spent way too much time praising as the guiding light for how Disney stories are formed. They are the backbone of the hero's journey, challenging perspectives and delighting in the evil business they get down to doing. And even though in the past I called them integral to Disney's own formula, where they need them to make their movies thrive for the most part, Pixar on the other hand have proven their capabilities to move beyond that. Don't get me wrong, Pixar villains are great when they are at their best in terms of the storytelling, and I've already covered a multitude of videos praising them as characters, but how compared to Disney they don't always have to have them and still work regardless. We say this obviously because other Disney movies for the most part, like Strange World to talk about recently, lack that extra quality that would have improved events overall. Again, not to say that they aren't capable of doing it without such characters, because there are some films, but still never to an extent that Pixar has done, where its quality outshines the need of actually having one. This is an example that can be seen recently with films like Elemental, Turning Red, Soul, Onward, and so forth. A list that shows too few main antagonistic threats in between, counting the disappointing Zurg from Lightyear or the bully Urkel from Luca, where the list doesn't show the best in terms of anything memorable recently, but how they can tell their emotional movies the way that they know how best. Both in terms of past, present, and future, is the image of how their own villains are ones that blend really well in the thematic backgrounds, where they are memorable and iconic for what they are, but not in the same way a Disney villain would appear to be when they are at their best. Like the main focal point of any Pixar film is the world that surrounds it, the idea of what is being strived for in a different unreal form, whether it be a toy or shrinking down to the size of an ant to learn about their particular lifestyle, where if it does, it also is hyped up to a degree with powers, but how again it doesn't have to necessarily have the image if the story lines up. I mean, some of you might think what I'm about to add will feel redundant and unnecessary since I constantly covered aspects of anti or twists that don't really need to be regarded as villains in some cases, but how I think it's equally important to reveal what Pixar wants to say about the world in this very form. So to start this off, we are going to highlight films that actually do have characters that qualify as villains, but aren't really major components in the story overall. You think about other characters like Darla from Finding Nemo as a great example to start with because of how low of an impact she has on the story of Finding Nemo, and any other obstacle that actually comes across our main fish characters like Bruce, who is activated by Dory's blood. Not really an antagonist, but an antagonistic threat activated by a certain presence. In this case, you don't have to have a true opposing antagonistic threat or force because of how that's not the point of Finding Nemo at all. It's more of the series of circumstances where it doesn't actually need to exist. If there was an actual villain, what would be the point of having them at all, when that's not the case where it really needs to be? Sure, it can work if you had that main villain cause such events in the first place, like turning the human into the ultimate evil who threatens all sea life or something like that, but that kinda seems too comical for where Nemo was headed. Instead, you solve this by having people and places act as those individual circumstances that aren't really villainous at all, but are the true obstacles in the course of the film Finding Nemo. Darla is just a kid who wants things from her uncle, who happens to be listed as the secondary antagonist of the film, but also not really an antagonist in that form, since he's a dentist who thinks he's helping out the sea creatures he finds and anyone in his office. Where in Finding Dory, we really don't get any major villainous threats at all either, because that story satisfies what its world and characters were about too, and having that extra element would just not make sense. Adding something like that would just bloat it with unnecessary nonsense and hinder the emotional impact that these films were known for, and villains aren't usually involved in such actions. So when you think about this world, you're really focusing on that very subject that is filled with a multitude of creatures both good and bad, alongside a journey that only the sea could provide. Of course, films released after this like Cars, Ratatouille, and Wall-E also do have villains that are seen in one way from beginning to end, but their impact still isn't the same like a Disney villain would normally bring. They aren't a major evil force that drives apart the main hero other than stopping their goals from coming true. Yes, they do interact with them in negative ways like Lightning competing with Chick Hicks, Skinner chasing after Remy, and Otto trying to damage Wall-E, but they don't really go toe-to-toe at all like what we just mentioned. How it's more similar in the case of Nemo that is created from circumstances that surrounds him to get to their goal, where its real heart relies on somewhere else rather than what is cared for in that particular moment, whether it be reflections of our true selves and passions and what happens when we lose our way, allowing automation to take over. It's about thinking about the subject around the film, that a villain does not necessarily need to exist to be in a story, but also how a minor one can contribute a lot if the movie still fits it. The quality of their villains that stand up on an entirely different level. You can think about this applying to Inside Out 2, where it relies mostly on the emotions inside this one girl or any other human being. The conflict that happens around others who can only demonstrate what emotion they are, like sadness and joy, but learning to live with each other since that's what makes us truly human, not being able to live without each other in that process. Which of course, to be fair, in the sequels part, it seems like the new characters will suffice for those villains in that way, but also act like these ones I just mentioned, making them different as emotions or as main characters. Because when you think about the events that truly surround them, whether it be this interaction with John or this interaction with a simple object, it feels like the conflict is entirely played within their own view, their own mind, and what is around the world. This example can also be seen perfectly in Toy Story 4, where even though this franchise is known for having villains in each of their films that go above and beyond, 4 still usually takes a step back from that viewpoint, again mentioning what I've already talked about with an anti-villain like Gabby Gabby, a toy who wants to find her time to be loved and played with. Of course, that is still a villain that has to exist for the sake of the story and Woody trying to find his next stage in life, but it's not the only thing that needs to happen, as she is again trying to be a part of someone's life rather than to learn to move on. In one way, you can easily remove all the supposed antagonistic undertones about her and her minions, and you wouldn't lose anything in that story at all. The outcomes would roughly be the same, where no villain would need to actually have a dramatic impact on that very story. His interactions with Bo Peep is the main heart of it all, rather than something villainous like Lotso from Toy Story 3 or Stinky Pete from 2, where she is just overall another toy. Granted, the others, except Sid, were toys too, but talking about it from this perspective of our main heroes or side characters that were involved from beginning to end, or the newer ones introduced like the Canadian toy Keanu Reeves played, actually demonstrates this certain point of view, that they can come all from different backgrounds of neglect or want that the toy needs in their life, but the outcomes can always differ. Their hearts don't have to be hardened by a certain point to finally find fulfillment, which is a true testament to their ability as a studio to tell real grounded stories through the eyes of most inanimate objects or non-humans of any type. So the example here is the fact of having evil in the movie is not truly necessary to include in a Pixar film, where the next few years of the Disney Plus era of Pixar, except for Luca and Lightyear, showed movies that had no villains at all. You think about stories like Onward going on similar journeys that we've seen earlier in Finding Nemo, and how that actually doesn't have any villains at all in this mystical modern D&D style adventure. How it shouldn't have a big villain in its story because the story is not about that and about finding what was lost from our main heroes being their father and discovering what we have right now. Yes, I might not like it as other Pixar movies in my case, but it still is a very good movie on its own for where its true message lies, and that didn't really need a villain by the way they played it out. The case that can be enhanced with Soul 2 that really does focus on the soul of its entire movie, where the only villainous character would in fact be Terry, who's just doing their job. A perfectionist at best who wants to ensure that all souls are accounted for, which doesn't really have an impact on this story between Joe and 22. Again, another case of you can easily wipe her away from the story and nothing major would be lost except for certain events that need to happen. There is a situation happening in the world, or the worlds of soul factoring in the great before and the great beyond, and it just needs a little push to make it move forward. And when you have something like that, when it focuses on your life, you again find yourself not needing that villain element, as that shouldn't exist in the story unless you make it so. That you are your own villain in most cases instead if you go along that journey. Something I mentioned back with Charles Muntz in the Up as the Dark Side of Carl had he gone down that path, because that's what most of these foes are trying to represent. The villain of self-doubt that stories like Turning Red and Elemental taught us in this cultural side of life. And for films like these, it's more important to highlight the antagonistic forces within our own well-meaning family rather than actual villains, to say what we can or can't do and the sacrifices that come along the way to protect us. Like the conflict in this film is May turning into a panda like her family has done for generations, but more about the added pressure that comes with our own parents with the expectations that we would never be good enough or never able to express ourselves in their own way. The same thing with Elemental, with Ember trying to find out who she is and what she wants to do. The prejudice between Elements and running her father's business, while her skills are good at making something new and learning to live with others who accept who they are. Where in both cases, you truly notice the lack of opposing forces more than these other films I have mentioned, but also hardly care enough for it to even exist at all. We just circle back to the beginning, where it's all about the world that they inhabit that matters the most. The mixture of emotional dialogue and powerful music to sell you where something needs to be headed. You feel as if your mind is the area that causes the most conflict within you, talking about the best way to please not only yourself, but to others. Like if I were to do this or try that or do this instead, what would actually happen? It is all based on the case of what type of style is this studio most known for. What good can they bring that is different than the rest that does work the most if they do or don't have such characters that support such a message? That they are able to do so rather than Disney because there is that element that makes them unique, that works well, that a certain group of people know how best to show. Where if they try something that works opposite, if it isn't infused with the cultural mix, it probably ends up not working at all. But for this case, for what is trying to be presented in these very certain worlds, I guess we don't need to worry about that to tell a good story. And with that said, I'm all done. Goodbye.